So, it's my pleasure and the privilege to introduce this important session on changing world order and how we need to reinforce the power of inclusiveness. To and today's discussion, may I invite Ms. Palki Sharma on dais, please. Thank you. Today's discussion, I would like to open with none other than Vandana Shiva, a renowned Indian scholar and environmentalist activist. She quotes says that, which reads, "We are either going to have a future where women lead the way to make peace with the earth, or we are not going to have a human future at all." Of course, she speaks about sustainability and environment, which, by the way, is also the strands in the upcoming discussions. But today, I would like to stress on how she focuses on women-led future. It is also heartwarming, but also provides a deep sense of stability and security. When I look back and notice how we have evolved from discussing women development to discussing women-led development. What a quantum leap for India, but it has not been easy, might not be easier either. So we have two eminent people on the dais. First, we have Ms. Palki Sharma, currently the managing editor of Network 18. She is an award-winning journalist and is building and leading a new big-ticket, multi-platform international news project in the network. Before this, she was the managing editor of WION, India's only international news channel with a presence of over 190 countries. Ms. Palki Sharma hosted India's most watched primetime English news show called Gravitas, and the internationally acclaimed digital show called Gravitas Plus. She is also conceptualized and led the channel's annual event in Dubai called the WION Global Summit. Ma'am, just 5 months back, Feb 2023, Ms. Palki Sharma had an interesting talk show which she spoke about how women leaders from across the globe are leaning out instead of leaning in. You spoke boldly about how it is giving a wrong idea out to the young women, and most importantly, how the subcontinents can teach a lesson or two on how young women leaders have perceived. I look forward to having you in this discussion and taking this discussion forward. We have Madam Minister Smriti Irani with us, a very dynamic leader who plays an important role in India's story, with country poised to become a developed nation by 2047. She is currently the Minister for Women and Child Development and also the Minister for Minority Affairs. Prior to this, she has been the Minister for Education, Information, Broadcasting and Textiles. She is the youngest Union Cabinet Minister. Prior to joining politics, she was an influential social activist and a media leader. Ma'am, what a powerful, sorry, I'm not going to use the word term powerful because after watching your show, leveraging India's better half for economy and social growth, I would rather use the term impactful. When an impactful statement she made on how she feels women is truly powerful when she takes a decision for herself. Ma'am, you rightly said you don't seek anybody's validation for who you are today, and it will be a pleasure to hear you on how we are going to cascade that ideology to women alike across the globe because that also serves as a making women truly powerful and taking their own decisions for their own self without looking for validation. And clearly, in the days and the age, we don't want to do something just said, but we want it to be done. As our Prime Minister says, women-led development plays a vital role in increasing the speed and the scale of India's progress. And so we want to open this flow to the most powerful, impactful, and successful women of today, Madam Minister Smriti Irani and Ms. Palki Sharma. Thank you so much.
Thank you and good morning to all of you. Namaskar. It's good to be here, especially with a woman leader that I've always admired, Ms. Irani. The subject for this event is equal opportunity and inclusiveness. And that's where I would like to begin with. The word woman has been used repeatedly in our introduction. But in our world today, gender is said to be not a binary. Pronouns have become political. And I think personal orientation is more customized than pizza. In a world like this, what does inclusivity mean to you?
I think when you look at it societally, I'm very proud as an Indian that civilizationally we have been inclusive. That we have not limited our respect only to the human form, but extended it to plants, rivers, mountains. When you talk politically, yes, gender today has a plurality to it which was never seen before. But it also gives birth to many an administrative complexities. Complexities that tug at your civilization or your societal values. Cantankerous debates that bring new thoughts, bring new subjects that one needs administrative reflection on. I think from a governance perspective, inclusion is not limiting solution to one silo. Inclusion also means getting multiple voices to speak on issues that are not only old, but issues that may crop up in the future. Inclusion also means recognizing challenges of the past, ensuring that you apply solutions to the present in such a fashion that the past doesn't repeat itself. But we are ultimately all human. Hence, there will always be room for more negotiation. There will always be room for more conversation. But there will always be room for more decisive decision making. So, inclusivity does not mean to conform to every standard. I believe inclusivity means to recognize every space, every individual need, and doing something which is for the greater good.
And it's interesting that you bring in the civilizational aspect of inclusivity in India. And I think we're the only country in the world where rivers are called goddesses and trees are, respected in the way they are. And yet, in a social context, in terms of opportunity, there are challenges. Would you say that the world you are growing up, you are in right now, and the country that you're leading, is more inclusive than the society that you grew up in?
I think now there is a recognition of India's inclusive nature worldwide. There was a myopia that people were afflicted with vis-a-vis how they perceived India to be. When Prime Minister Modi speaks on international fora, especially vis-a-vis sustainable development, when he talks about being progressive on issues of climate solutions, that's when people are a bit taken aback that is this what India's always been about? So I think that when you talk about inclusive agendas of governance, be it climate change, be it gender, we need to recognize that we are at a time in our history where we can learn from what has happened across the world, solutions that people thought were the magic that everybody was waiting for that failed, solutions which are at the borders of our humanity right now, which are frugal in terms of innovation and monies and resources, but who can, when we combine our energies together, can possibly bring to a larger scope of work, to a larger scape of people, and possibly multiply in terms of efforts only if we believe in convergence of efforts.
Right. Now that I hear you talk, I'm reminded of how diverse and how widespread the agenda is and how immense the body of work has been. And as policymakers, I'm sure you deal with a lot of issues. But what gets talked about, and as part of the media, I can say that, that is what occupies the mind space, is a very narrow understanding of inclusivity and opportunity. And as India sort of sets the agenda on the global stage, India is also sometimes being called out by its partners for not being inclusive enough as a society. How do you see this?
I think the buzz in the room right now is because you and I are being very, very inclusive in our conversation. The minute there is a sense of friction in the dialogue between us, everybody will perk up. And I think that is what happens with headline hunting. How do you bring to another fore a nation that is growing exponentially financially? You deal with it with an element of surprise, especially during the pandemic. If you remember, before the pandemic, conversations across the globe about India was that we are a billion plus people. And especially there are over 600,000 villages in our country. How will the population there survive? There were many naysayers across the world who said, how will those in India receive pharmaceutical support or support in terms of vaccinations? How will India get it done? And while there were many people who pontificated at that time, many were taken by surprise when we came up with COVID. And the surprise was that it took a very short amount of time for us to technologically apply ourselves to a solution. While there were many nation states that were still writing a chit, handwritten note for vaccinations for their citizens. We're the one country that also was, I think, humane enough to see a convergence between the Prime Minister and the people, where the Prime Minister gave a clarion call, stay indoors to protect yourselves. People heeded. The Prime Minister gave a clarion call, appreciate the frontline workers. People heeded. The Prime Minister said, let's support the frontline workers. I had 6 million Indian women at the front line, going from door to door, collecting samples, giving medication, converging efforts with hospitals across the country. Now, this is an India that the world had not seen. So while borders across the world were shutting down, I had the principal opportunity of being the textiles minister. India had never manufactured a PPE suit in 70 years of our democratic history. And suddenly, a country which did not have raw material, which did not have machinery to produce PPE suits, was confronted with the supply of only 55,000 suits, which we had imported the last year. And we, with global supply chains choked, borders shutting down, managed to not only create PPE suits, we went from 0 companies to 1,100 companies in 3 months. And in the 4th month, we became the 2nd largest exporters in the world. Which means that when an Indian has a back to the wall, they fight back, but they do it elegantly. They manufacture, they repurpose their systems. And I think that is one of the greatest stories of the pandemic, that we could showcase to the world our capacities. But what I'm prouder still of the Indian achievement is that we did not leave the fruits of our labors to ourselves. We engaged with 160 countries. We responded to their needs. We ensured that they got PPE suits from our country. We ensured that they got vaccinations. They got pharmacological support from our country. If you want to define inclusion, that's true inclusion. Because it's easy to be inclusive when the coffers are full. It's easy to be inclusive when things are warm and fuzzy, as I normally say. It's easy to be inclusive when everything is going right. The true test of a civilization, of an individual as well, is when the back is to the wall. Can you still find kindness? So I think what India has shown is not only largesse during the pandemic, it has shown what it can do with its manufacturing capacities, how innovative we as a nation state are. And at the same time, if you look at strategically, geopolitically, what we have said is that we are the only nation state that you will find in the global south that does not choke its supply chains for geopolitical strategic needs.
And I would like to say here that sometimes, even when your coffers are full, you cannot find the generosity. There have been countries that have kept vaccines on their shelves and let them go to waste instead of sharing them with the world. And I hear you when you say that idea of inclusivity speaks through our development policies. As the G20 chair and as arguably one of the most diverse countries in the world, what are the learnings and the lessons you think India can share with the world on equal opportunity and inclusivity?
I think that there has to be a redefinition of how you compute development. For instance, in the World Economic Forum, when they compute the Global Gender Gap Index, they do not take into consideration many an interventions or many a contributions by the Indian female political ecosystem. For instance, we have 1 million plus women serving as elected representatives in our panchayats, which is our village grassroots administrative ecosystem. They are never considered as politically empowered when the gender report is made vis-a-vis India. We do not have the Global Gender Gap Index take into consideration women who are elected to our legislative assemblies. They do not take women who are elected into not only legislative assemblies, but also women who are ministers in the Council of Ministers. Which means if you just quantify this particular aspect of the political power of women in India, our numbers will start rising. The issue is who questions such computation. For instance, they would say that if you look at the economic contribution of women in India, they will not consider women who are in the MSME sector. They will not consider women who are in self-help groups participating economically at the grassroots. Now, if you look at just the financial bandwidth of women in the self-help group ecosystem in India, they amongst the 8 million self-help groups currently functional in our country, they manage funds worth $30 billion. Can you imagine not computing them when you recognize what is the economic potential of Indian women? And I think that when the Prime Minister says that we are the shoulder, we're the strongest shoulder of the Global South, this is what he means, that when we put forth such conversations, we have many partners in African nations, in island nations, even in the Global South, who say that let's look at how you compute contribution financially, societally, when you look at sustainability, when you look at Human Development Index, and look at these new nuances that are creeping forth. So I think that especially the G20 presidency and our engagement with women ministers across the G20 universe, these are the conversations that have strongly come forth.
Right, and I agree with you that when international bodies look at rankings, some of them are way off the mark. For instance, on press freedom, we are ranked below Afghanistan, which I don't understand. But our own surveys, the Economic Survey of India table this year admits that India's rank has fallen on the Gender Inequality Index. And your government prides itself in policies that put women at the front and center of how you're looking at development. Why then is the rank falling, according to you?
I think we need, like I said, you need to compute even statistically how we as a nation state have internally emphasized on certain issues vis-a-vis, let's say, labor, let's say contribution financially again to a household, unpaid work as it is called, also the care economy where many segments of female contribution go unaccounted for. So that is why when we have the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council now re-look at the stats. For instance, since we are talking about how numbers are computed internally, We have the National Family Health Survey that computes data with regards to child nutrition from among 600,000 families. Now, at the same time, now the Ministry of Women and Child Development started a digital engagement across 1.39 million Anganwadis in the country, which is fed data by 2.2 million female workers on the ground every day. We compute data for close to 70 million children every day. Their height, their weight, their status, their well being every day. You will be shocked that only in the month of March, from the 15th to the 30th of March, close to 70 million kids got their measures and weights and height taken as per the WHO standard. And we suddenly found that we were doing 12% better than the National Family Health Survey. So we had a larger size, sample size, as compared to the National Family Health Survey, but we were digitally available with data as per WHO standards. We had a third party intervention by the World Bank. So now we are data rich and we need to make sure that the twains meet. So that is why, even internally, when you see a little bit of a glitch as to why these two segments are not meeting, that is because statistically we've had a legacy in our country which never took into consideration how quickly technology can bring forth multiple sets of data and how analytics can now give us a better view.
Do you think there's so that's one part of the challenge. The other, according to you, would you agree with this, that the world finds it difficult to fathom what India is? We're a very diverse country, and they're looking at us from a very narrow lens. And a lot of these countries are, whether it be ethnicity or religion, they're very.
Well, I can tell you from personal experience when I was Minister Education and I went to the headquarters at UNESCO, people were most fascinated by my surname, Irani. And they asked me, how does that surname come to be? And I spoke about the Zoroastrian community, which is the micro minority, if you would so call it. There are only 60,000 of them left in the entire world. They escaped persecution. They found a home in India close to 300 years ago. And they thrived. They are some of the biggest corporate houses today in the country. That alone is a manifestation of our capacity to be inclusive. So, yes, I completely agree with you that many are taken aback by the fact that we have over 16,000 dialects, that we have 125 constitutionally recognized languages, that we have a diverse set of people that live in harmony, that we also have the capacity to take into and give shelter to those who have been persecuted across the world. You are home to not only Zoroastrians but also Jews, Baha'is. They never get spoken about.
Right. And I think Europe, for one, is struggling with, they took in a lot of immigrants. And this is veering into the political, but I must ask you this because you are also the Minority Affairs Minister of India. And maybe you have some advice for the Europeans. The European Parliament had a debate, a 20-minute long debate. They said, we don't want to wag a finger at India, but that's exactly what they did. And they, out of all things in the world, discussed Manipur. But this is also a continent that took in a lot of immigrants, and they don't know how to assimilate them.
I think that there is a very old Indian Hindi adage which serves this question best. It's called Diya Tale Andhera. So my Indian counterparts and fellow citizens will understand this. But while you say that anybody is trying to wag a finger at India, it is true that they are faced with some historical challenges currently, societally, financially. And given my Indian disposition, I would not like to be discourteous. But at the same time, stand firm my ground and say, mind your own business.
Very well said. I think this calls for a round of applause. And within the country, right from the independence to now, successive governments in their own way, given their own political exigencies, have tried to implement inclusive policies. And one of them was, I think, quota. And that's something that's not a uniquely Indian challenge anymore. the recent headlines have come from the United States where they're talking about affirmative action and getting more people into colleges, and the Supreme Court has struck it down. But the debate still remains on whether reservation or quota is the way to ensure inclusivity.
I think affirmative action, like you've seen in India, especially when it comes to women. For instance, in my political organization, I rose to the ranks of being the national president of the women's wing. But before that, I rose to the ranks of being the national secretary of my political organization because of affirmative action within my organization. That it was brought forth by a man is extremely heartily welcomed by women in my political disposition. But I also feel that we've had a historical challenge of many segments of our society that were inundated with challenges because they were bereft of education and opportunities to not only skill themselves but also reach out and fulfill their entrepreneurial ambitions. For instance, if you look at how affirmative action plays out, let's say in the financial segment, everybody speaks in India about the Mudra Yojana, where small loans are given to small establishments and businesses, collateral free. We've had around 37 crore such loans given out. 70% of the loans were taken up by women in our country. Now, this was not a gendered financial intervention by the Prime Minister. However, what it gave birth to was, if you look at 2014 and before that, conversation about female enterprise was that they lacked financial support to recognize or to realize their entrepreneurial ambitions. Now, suddenly the Prime Minister comes forth with a loan collateral free for small businesses. Nobody said it's only meant for women. However, women in our country, and particularly from the so-called disenfranchised, economically challenged backgrounds. Imagine this, they sat down, made a business plan, went to a bank, got a loan after convincing the bank, the financial institution, that their business plan is viable. They serviced the loan. The NPA for women in that loan segment is less than 2%. Then the Prime Minister comes up with a program called Stand Up, where now the collateral-free loan goes up to 1 crore. And he says that in every district, make sure at least one female-led enterprise, one enterprise from the SC/ST community is always given some kind of support. 40,000 crore rupees goes into that particular segment of giving loans for, let's say, a medium-scale enterprise. 80% of beneficiaries turned out to be women. So many actions in terms of education, yes, are endowed with the space of reservation, quota, or affirmative action that you call of. But I think that one of the most welcoming agendas is the fact that the Prime Minister gave the nation 2 levels of engagement financially vis-a-vis enterprise. And in both these engagement levels, we saw women do very well. So if you look at even our results in high school, girls are beating boys. But what happens when you see their transition, let's say from the school system to the college system? It is not as robust as we would like it to be. But at the same time, when you look at them doing enterprise, you suddenly see a surge of women across many segments of manufacturing, or many segments of processing, or many segments of agriculture. So I think that we live in an age of good chaos, where women are trying to find a space for themselves, especially women who come from, like I said, societally challenged backgrounds. And if we can make space so that not only we speak of equality, we also speak of equity, then I think India has done well on that front.
I want to now bring in 2 A's, and they can be potential challenges but also opportunities for women. One is attitude. Is it changing enough with the
Yes.
policy change? And the second is...
No, I think attitude is changing not only in policy makers but also
No, policy is changing,
people
but the people,
at large.
You think it is? You think it is?
Yes, I think that what I'm very proud of as an Indian is the fact that Indians know that this is their time. Is the fact that Indian knows that there is a Goldman Sachs report somewhere which says that we will outdo a particular economy and be the number 2 economy in the world. Is the fact that Indians know now that they are the 5th largest economy in the world, but they're not sitting pretty. They are saying we want to strive further so that we become the most robust and the best economy in the world, because when the fruits of that development come to my country, we know how to share it with the rest of the world. So the attitude, yes, is positively brimming. There is a huge surge of confidence, but it is combined well with compassion.
The second A I wanted to talk about was AI, artificial intelligence. It is a disruptor, it is the future, it's something we cannot wish away. Recently, a startup made news, they fired 90% of their staff to hire robots to do it, and they said it made business sense, and you can't blame an entrepreneur for trying to limit costs. The fact is that AI will disrupt jobs, just like the pandemic did. But in the pandemic, the biggest sufferers were women. Do you think that this disruption is also going to disproportionately impact a certain section of society, including women?
I think that the agenda that women will always be the gender that suffers is an agenda that needs to be addressed. Because in that echo chamber of suffering is monies for many and institutions that we rather put money into productive segments of female engagement. For instance, I remember when the pandemic gave birth to chatter across the world that millions of Indian children are orphaned. And there was a cry out by many and organizations to everybody across the world, give us money so that we can look after the orphans of India. I took umbrage to it then. And I said, show me the statistics. Give me the evidence. And the minute me, as a minister or the Supreme Court of India, started asking for evidence, you would be shocked, all that chatter stopped. And we then went meticulously from district to district, from house to house, looking for children who are in need of support, whose parents had passed away during the pandemic. We found 4,300 such children in a 1.4 billion plus nation. Those children now are looked after by families. Those children are financially provided for by none other than the Prime Minister of the country. Those children now have an administrative guardian in the name of the district magistrate. We know how to look after our own kids. Similarly, when you talk about this continuous suffering of women in India, there was again a pronouncement, if you remember, by the UN General Secretary, that now 80% of women in India will get beaten up because they are home. And I had asked for empirical evidence from my colleagues in UN Women in New York. I said, can you please tell me where this evidence comes from? She says, it's a fear we are projecting. So I think that we are today at a time in our economy and societally where we are aware of our rights and responsibilities. I think it is a bit, again, myopic that we are talking about women with just 2 women on stage. I'm sure it would have been a more robust conversation if we had 2 gentlemen as well. But I think I can assure our friends in the G20 universe, women in India know how to take care of themselves, and we know how to take care of the men too who don't know what to do.
I think it's a tricky one. You know, recently Japan hosted something on women empowerment, and all G7 representatives were there. And Japan was the only country; it was the host country, and the only country that sent a man, and they were sort of trolled for it. So I think it's tricky now whether to send a man to a discussion on inclusivity or not.
I think one of the greatest disservice to the family unit or to my gender has been when you want to disassociate engagements with men on issues that afflict families, societies, or for that matter, my gender. To believe that a man will not have a very realistic view of needs of women is actually reverse discrimination towards men. I'm very proud of the fact that we, since the 1960s, had a legislation that was pending parliamentary consent, which was medical termination of pregnancy at 24 weeks. It was a man in Prime Minister Modi that ensured both houses of parliament passed that legislation, and not a single Indian man spoke about the reproductive rights of women in my country. I'm very proud of it. Secondly, I'm very proud, we've had a female Prime Minister before, but I'm very proud that my Prime Minister stood from the ramparts of the Red Fort and said, women, please, for menstrual hygiene, now in our country, over 9,000 medical establishments provide sanitary napkins for 1 rupee. That conversation has never happened in the Independence Day speech of any country in the world. I'm very proud of it. So I think men in my country are normalizing this engagement. I hope it is the same for every nation state.
We can only hope, because there are some countries that are sort of going into the reverse and taking away the reproductive rights of women. But that's probably a discussion for another day. We are also addressing a community of business leaders, of investors. And enough and more studies have shown that inclusivity and equal opportunity also reflects in the performance of your company.
Yes.
And yet, it doesn't come naturally to most, not just in India, but the whole world. I mean, you look at Fortune 500 companies, not enough women are leading them. Why do you think that is the case? Is it because of inertia?
I think that if you are of a opinion that, for instance, when it comes to innovation and research, you will have many women in the scientific streams who innovate well, who have very, very stupendous scientific achievements, but they cannot accelerate their innovation enough to turn it into a viable financial prospect for themselves. Most of them give it up because they see that funders would not want to take a risk with a female innovator. That is a mindset that needs to be addressed. I think governments do better when we not only support funding for female scientists and innovators, but we also give additional support to them so that they can transition their innovation into manufacturing capacities. I also feel that those who feel India is only about Ayurveda, yoga, or a lifestyle need to possibly see the exhibition which is next door. We are also about drones. We are also about manufacturing electric vehicles that can be used by military establishments. And if you look behind me, we are also about fighting fit to our Air Force. So there are many opportunities now India presents through its manufacturing capacities. Yes, it is a challenge that now we need more and more female support for transition, because our entry level economic capacity through self-help groups, through SMEs is very, very, I think, vibrant. We need to now move from small enterprise to women-led mid-sized companies. We do have women who have done well in the unicorn segment, in the startup segment, but I think it's time for us as women to fill up the mid-sized company segment as well.
Since you mentioned yoga, we've projected it as part of our soft power, and, turmeric latte or whatever it is that the world is having.
I want the
Bollywood.
royalty for India from turmeric latte, please.
Right, and of course we've shown the world our hard power. I mean,
Yes.
when there is a neighbor that crosses a line, you go and conduct surgical strikes, and that is the hard power of India, which is very much there. Do you think it's time now, through this platform of G20 and the ones that come after it, to also project India's inclusivity and diversity as a very significant core of our soft power?
I think that it takes a lot for me to address this particular question. Because yes, we as a nation state are inclusive. Yes, there is a side to our power that is soft, that is healing. But at the same time, we are unapologetic about defending our interests, our borders, our people.
Now, this is a bit of a googly, and we did a story recently, and I thought I'm going to have a conversation with you later this week, so I will ask you. You've had many stages in your career, and I must say you aced all of them. And one of it was you were a finalist in a Miss India contestant, among other things. Recently, a Miss Netherlands was crowned, and the first trans woman to be crowned as Miss Netherlands, who will be the first trans woman to participate in the Miss Universe contest. And this has been an ongoing debate because we're talking about inclusivity in sport and other competitions. Do trans people, should they be clubbed with women? Do they get an undue advantage? Should there be a separate category? Then why have categories at all?
Well, mercifully in our country, administratively, that particular segment of gender is looked after by the Social Justice Department. So, I can only speak for women.
Okay.
Proudly so.
Right.
I think we have enough challenges as a gender, enough people trying to venture into our space. So I'm administratively and constitutionally mandated to protect that space.
Very well said. When you ventured into politics, did you think that this is going to be one of the cornerstones of your political career to foster this inclusive policy making and to push for things like these?
I am very proud of the fact that my country renewed its national education policy. I was one of the people who drafted the foundation paper after 3 decades. But how inclusive can governance be? I think the national education policy was one of the biggest such examples. We began in 2014. We went to over 200,000 village education councils in our country that had never been asked what should policy be. We went to every college, every university, every school in the country, met every parent teacher association in the country, called for every academic council to give their input, spoke to every former education minister of the country, spoke to every former current secretaries in the government of India and in state governments, spoke to UNICEF, UN Women, UNDP, spoke to the Indian diaspora across the world. Tell us, what do you think that your education policy should be like? We've had 7 decades of policy being made in the halls of power in New Delhi. For the first time, the policy maker went to the people and said, tell us what is the kind of education you'd like yourself to have, or for that matter, for your family or your children to have. And I think truly if inclusion in terms of policy making was ever written about, the national education policy is one such thing. I'm very proud that I had a 2 decade media background to myself. But at the same time, I'm prouder yet that not only the national education policy, the first ever national ranking framework for our country for educational institutions was brought forth when I was Minister Education. The first MOOCs platform for India was brought forth when I was the Minister for Education. And the fact that when my country was challenged by the pandemic, globally so as well, I had the privilege of making sure that India not only becomes self-sufficient in PPE suits, but I also had the privilege of contributing to making sure that technical textiles becomes a very prominent part of the economy. So yes, I can say as a citizen, I feel fulfilled that I am led today by a Prime Minister who gives me opportunities to do a variety of contributions to my polity, to my economy, to my society. But I'm 47, not dead yet, so expect more from me in the future.
We definitely do. As an individual, as a leader, as a professional, what do you do, this is beyond the policy, to inculcate the idea of equal opportunity within your team and in the society around you?
I think you can do it twice over, as an individual who governs and as an individual who's bringing up 2 children. So I remember in education, I had a male bureaucrat walk up sheepishly to me and say, I cannot say this to my colleagues, but I need to help my son who is studying for the 10th standard. And I need time off. And I happily gave him so, because I believe that I'd created an environment in my office space where a man was comfortable enough to say, I need time off for something, otherwise my wife would have to take time off for. Because the wife was working in another department. So I was very much aware of the balance of the nature of their relationship. I think what is also equally important is to recognize that belief systems are inculcated in people at a very, very young age. There comes a time in everybody's lives when their belief system gets challenged. But to believe that at 50 you can inculcate a behavior pattern very easily itself would be not understanding of the human nature. So I think that when you want to talk about equity, equality, these are things that need to get institutionalized in an individual at a very small age. And that is why I'm very, very proud of the fact that the Prime Minister insisted on having a gender inclusion fund, especially within the national education policy, where he says, let's not talk about gender only in the curriculum when children are older. Let's talk about it on every platform that matters. And that is why he speaks about gender in Independence Day. He speaks about a tectonic shift in administration. And he says, stop looking at women who need to be defined as citizens who always need a dole, who always need a helping hand. Relook at how you imagine or how you project the imagery of women in our country. Talk about women led development so that people at large recognize that if you want to lead financially, powerfully, you need to make sure women are equal partners. So I think conversations matter. I think engagements matter and every word spoken matters because we today are in a position of service that can define how people can be projected or looked upon for decades to come. So I think the fact that we are the fifth largest economy in the country, in the world today, and we speak about women-led development equally proudly, speaks volumes about how far we have come as a civilization. We had a gap there where we looked upon as only victims who needed help. Now we have somebody saying they are equal partners, they are leaders in their own right. Recognize them respectfully.
Right. We have 2 more minutes, so I want to also, since we have a global audience, talk about inclusivity from a geopolitical perspective. What do you think will it take to give due representation to the global South on international platforms like the United Nations? I know the Prime Minister and the Government of India now are raising the voice of the global South, but I also know that some of the most powerful bodies in the world are still controlled by a handful of veto-wielding powers. And for all of these bodies that talk about inclusion, they're not sort of leading by example.
I agree. I also feel that we seek a position at that table not because we beg for it, but because we deserve it. And that shift in engagement and narrative is also very significant. I remember my engagements at Davos at the World Economic Forum. And when I met American investors, I said, well, we in India have proved what we can do. It is a good time to partner with us. And if there is no partnership, we in India will get it done anyways. So I think that the Prime Minister's recent visit to the United States and especially the significant engagements that resulted in technology transfer are historic in nature. The fact that they were done in areas which are significant from a security perspective, from a manufacturing perspective, is a recognition of India's emerging capacities as not only the leader of the global South, but world over. Like I said, we are leading with confidence, but we are also leading with compassion.
Absolutely. You know, the only country I think that's also a member of the Quad, but also a member of the SCO, rubbing shoulders with the North, global North, and also speaking for the global South. Final comments, ma'am. Do you think that India is showing by example how inclusivity in policy making, inclusivity in politics, inclusivity in your interaction with the world, where you look at national interests but you also fulfill international responsibility, is something that the world can learn from?
I think that Prime Minister Modi's leadership when it comes to sustainability and environmental responsibility is lauded the world over. I think the time has also come to look at issues such as financing climate needs the world over, especially from a context of responsibility. I also feel that when you want to protect the very idea of inclusivity, you need to see the impact of technology on it. And one of the greatest challenges today in terms of technology vis-a-vis inclusivity is the language barrier that it is creating. People look at it from a law and order perspective, but if we look at technology as a great leverage from the perspective of education, from the perspective of knowledge, how much of knowledge is getting lost in the translation is something we should look at strategically, something that we should look at from a perspective of finance, something we should look at from a perspective of not only opportunity. I also feel when you talk about AI and you talk about inclusion, which facets of our society the world over will be, let's say, sacrificed, or for that matter, will never be heard from again because of AI, is a topic for conversation which is essential. And I think lastly, we need a wider scope of what inclusion means, what youth means. For me, youth is not a number, it's a state of mind. So if you're looking at inclusion on a youthful platform, would you be sufficiently inclusive if you also spoke about geriatric care? So there are multiple facets to the term inclusion. There are also multiple facets to the term youth. I hope the twain, at least on this platform, can meet productively.
I think that's for me the biggest takeaway. I'm sure everyone has something to take from this conversation and from your insights. But the way you've expanded the scope and the way we look at the term inclusive is for me the biggest takeaway from this conversation. I think we need to have a 360-degree perspective of what inclusion means, and not just from the point of gender, which is where we began, I think, in our introduction. Thank you.
Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you both very much, and I'd like to call upon two of our attendees, Ariba and Nietzsche, to come up and offer words of thanks and a token of appreciation. You could join us on the stage, please. Ariba Raymond from France and our colleague from India.